Some debts you can write down. $1 here, a day's work there, a sack of grain you borrowed in a hard winter, those you can carry in a little book and settle when the season turns. I carried a book like that most of my life. Numbers in one column, names in the other, and a rule I never broke: don't die owing. But there's a kind of debt that has no number. I found that out in a canyon I couldn't find again if you gave me a map and a year to look. I was dying when a woman I'd been raised to fear knelt in the dirt and put her hands where the blood was leaving me. She didn't ask who I was. She didn't ask what my people had done to hers, and God knows they'd done plenty. She just kept me breathing, night after night, in secret, while men who shared my name and my color combed the hills looking to finish the job. She healed me when it would have been safer to let me go into the ground. And when I finally understood what that was worth, when I finally understood I'd never be able to pay it in the coin I knew, I did the only thing a stubborn man can do with a debt too big to carry. I emptied my hands. What I put in hers left her without a word. And I've spent every year since wondering if it was enough, or if some things just can't be squared, no matter what a man's willing to burn. This is how it happened, all of it, the parts I'm proud of and the parts I'm not. I woke up counting. That's the first thing my mind reached for, not where I was, not what had happened, but how much. Old habit. A man wakes in a strange dark with a fire in his side, and while any sensible fellow would be asking, am I alive, I was lying there trying to tally what it was going to cost me to be. Two things I knew before I knew anything else. One, I was on the ground, packed earth, cool against the back of my skull, the smell of it damp and mineral like a cellar. Two, something had been done to my side that hurt worse than the wound itself, a tight, drawn, stinging kind of hurt that meant somebody had been in there with more than good intentions. I tried to sit up. A hand came out of the dark and pressed flat on my chest and held me down. Not rough, just certain. The way you'd hold a spooked calf, no argument in it, only weight. I couldn't see her yet. My eyes were still swimming, and the only light was a low orange smear off to my left that I took for coals banked down small. But I could smell her. Wood smoke and something green and bitter, crushed leaves, and under that the plain animal smell of a body that had been working. She smelled like somebody who'd been keeping me alive with her hands, and later I'd learned that was exactly what she'd been doing, though it took me a shameful long while to let myself believe it. Water, I said. My voice came out like a boot dragged over gravel. She understood the word, or the shape of a man asking. A gourd touched my lips and tipped, and I drank too fast and choked, and she waited patient and gave me the rest slow. When I'd had it, she set the gourd down and went back to being a shape in the dark, and I lay there and did the thing I do when I'm scared, which is I try to get the accounts straight in my head. I am Elia's coil. It was the tail end of a dry June. I was riding the lower line, past the sink where the spring comes up, and there were men there who should not have been. And then the memory came all at once, the way a floor comes up when a chair leg breaks, and I was back in it. The spring, my brother Vance's men, 4 of them, and Ren Dutcher at the front of them with his hat pushed back, unbothered, doing the easy thing. They had a barrel down off a mule, and they were fixing to foul the water. Not just muddy it, foul it, with something out of that barrel that would sit in the seep for a season and turn it to poison. And I knew why, because it had been talked about at Vance's table like it was a matter of fence line and grazing, which was the way my brother talked about everything, even the things that had people on the other end of them. There were Apache camped down along the Black, a small band, mostly old ones and women and children, holding on to a scrap of ground the agents kept promising to move them off of. The spring was theirs before it was anybody's. Vance wanted it dry so they'd have to go, so he could run his cattle up through the sink without asking anyone. So a hard thing could be done by the land instead of by his own hand, and he could keep telling himself he was a Christian. I'd said no. That's the whole of it, really. I said no, and I said it with my hand near my gun because I'm my father's son and I don't know how to say no soft. And Ren Dutcher looked at me the way you look at a dog that's forgot whose dog it is, and he said, Vance said you'd turn stubborn, and he shot me. I remembered the horse going out from under me. I remembered the water. I'd gone down near the seep, and there was mud in my mouth, and the sky was very white and very far. I remembered Ren's voice saying, leave him. The country'll take him, and the sound of them riding off unhurried, because a shot man near a poisoned spring is not a thing you have to hurry away from. I did not remember her. That part was gone. Somewhere between the mud and the dark she'd come, and I'd missed it, and I've always been sorry I missed it because I'd have liked to know what it looked like. The moment somebody decided I was worth the trouble. "You were at the sink," I said to the dark, testing whether she had English. Nothing, but I felt her stillness change, the way the air changes before weather. "Those men, my brother's men." I don't know why I told her that, maybe to get out from under it. Maybe because when you owe somebody your life, the first thing you want to do is explain you're not the same as the men who tried to take it. I wasn't with them. I was trying to stop them. She said something then, low in her own tongue, 3 or 4 words, not to me, more like a person confirming a suspicion to herself. And then she leaned across me, and I felt her fingers, dry and quick, at the binding on my side, checking a knot, and I got my first real look at her face in the cold light. She was older than I'd figured from the sureness of her hands. There was gray coming in at her temples, and lines around her mouth and eyes that hadn't been put there by laughing. But her hands were young hands, is the thing, or the hands of somebody who used them so much they'd stayed strong past the rest of her. She had a way of holding her mouth that I came to know, a flat, unbudging line, the mouth of a person who has learned that showing what you feel is a thing that gets used against you. She did not look at me kindly. She looked at me the way you'd look at a wound you were treating, as a problem you'd taken on and would see through, not because you loved the problem, but because you'd put your hands in it, and now you were responsible. I want to be honest about the next part because it doesn't do me credit. My first clear thought looking at her, seeing what she was fear. Old, stupid, poured in with my milk fear. Every campfire story of my boyhood came up in my throat at once. My hand actually moved, went looking at my hip for the gun that wasn't there, that she'd taken, or that the sink had swallowed. She saw it, of course she saw it. She'd been 3 days keeping the breath in a man who reached for a gun the first minute he could focus his eyes. Something moved across her face. Not hurt, she was long past letting a thing like me hurt her. Something more tired than that. She sat back on her heels and looked at me and let me be afraid, let me sit in it and hear how it sounded. And then she said, in English, slow and flat and better than mine in its way, 3 nights I have been the only thing between you and the ground. If I wished you dead, Cowboy, I would only have to stop. And she got up and moved off to the coals and left me alone with that. I'll tell you now what took me a long time to work out about her, so you'll understand the rest. Her band was the small one down along the Black River that Vance wanted gone. What was left of it? There'd been more. Once I pieced this together over the days that followed, from what she said and mostly from what she didn't. There'd been a removal years back, soldiers walking them south to the agency at San Carlos, that flat, sick bottomland where the government liked to pile up people it had no more use for. A lot of them didn't come back from San Carlos. Fever came off that river in the summer and took the old and the small first. Her husband had died there. 2 of her children had died there. She'd walked back north with the ones who'd survived the walking, back to this country, because a person will crawl toward the only ground that ever felt like theirs, even when there's nothing left on it but the memory of being whole. She was a healer, had been since she was a girl, taught by her mother's sister, and the knowing had only deepened as everyone around her got sicker, and there was more and more call for it, and less she could do. That was the cruelty of her particular gift, I think. She'd been given hands that could do a great deal, and a life that put her in front of things no hands could fix. She'd sat with the dying at San Carlos and been able to give them nothing but cool water and her presence. She'd have plenty of practice at losing. And here I was, a white man, my brother's blood, found half dead not 2 miles from where her people were hiding, next to a spring my own kin were poisoning to finish what the soldiers had started. Any sensible person in her place would have looked at me lying in the mud and seen the whole history of her ruin wearing a man's face and walked on. Would have been right to walk on. She hadn't. I asked her about it once, days later, when we'd got to where we could talk a little. Asked her, clumsy, the way I ask things, why she'd bothered. Why she'd carried a coil up out of that wash on a travois she'd made herself and hidden him in a slot canyon and spent her nights she couldn't spare keeping him alive. She was grinding something in a stone bowl when I asked, and she didn't stop, and she didn't look up. She thought about it long enough that I figured she wasn't going to answer. Then she said, you were dying near the water. The water is ours. If a thing dies in the water is spoiled. A pause, the stone turning. I did not carry you, I cleaned the spring. She let that sit a beat, and then And this is the part I remember. This is where I first understood there was more to her than a face held flat. The corner of her mouth moved, just barely, and she added, "You were heavier than the spring wanted." That was as close to a joke as she came for a long while. I laughed, and it hurt my side like fire, and she watched me hurt with a small, grim satisfaction, like maybe I'd earned it. And that was the first minute I stopped being afraid of her and started being something else. Ashamed, I think. Ashamed is where it started. Those first days ran together. I'd wake and drink, and she'd change the dressing. She had a way with the wound I've never seen matched by any army surgeon, and I've been sewn up by a couple. She packed it with something that smelled like the whole desert crushed to paste, and she kept it clean past all reason, and the fever that should have taken me by rights never got its full grip. When I was strong enough, she fed me thin broth first, then a mush of seeds and a strip of dried meat I didn't ask the origin of. She spoke little. She came and went. There were long stretches I was alone, and I understood without being told that when she was gone she was tending to others, her own people, who needed her more than a coil did and got less of her because of me. That was the thing that started working on me. Every hour she spent keeping me alive was an hour stolen off somebody who had a better claim to it. A sick child, maybe. An old man coughing his lungs out on a bad mat. And she spent those hours on me anyway, on the enemy's brother, and she never once made me feel the cost of it, which somehow made the cost feel worse. I did what I do. I started keeping the book. I still had it. That's the small mercy that ran through the whole thing. When Ren shot me, I went down with my little debt book in my coat, the oilcloth one my father gave me, and it had ridden the mud and the fever right along with me, and she'd set it aside with my hat and my empty holster like it was mine and not hers to throw away. When I could hold a pencil, I got it out, and I did what I always did. I started an account. At the top of a clean page, I wrote a word for her, because I didn't have her name. She hadn't given it, and I hadn't earned the asking. I wrote the healer, and then I crossed it out because it felt like a thing you'd write on a stone, and I left the top of the page blank instead, just a blank line where a name should go, and under it I started tallying. Water, night of the shooting. Travoy, 3 nights watching. Root paste, don't know the name. Broth, the child's hour she gave to me instead of the child. I filled a page. I filled another. And somewhere in the filling I understood the thing that changed me, and I'll set it down plain because it's the hinge the whole rest of this turns on. There was no bottom to the column. I could tally forever and never reach a number. You can't put a figure on nights. You can't put a figure on a stranger deciding your life is worth her losing sleep and safety, and maybe worse, if her people found out she was hiding a coil, or if mine found out she was hiding me alive. There was no coin in my world that spent against what she'd done. I had a ranch, the lower quarter section that was mine and not Vance's, the one piece of my father's holding that the old man had left to me out of spite for his eldest, the one thing in the world that was legally, provably, on paper mine. And even that, I understood, lying there filling pages I'd never be able to balance, even that wouldn't cover it. It wasn't the right kind of thing. I closed the book. I lay in the dark of the slot canyon and listened to her breathing on the other side of the low coals. This woman who'd lost everything the men of my color could take from a person, and had knelt in the mud anyway. And I felt the account come open in me the way a wound comes open, and I knew I was going to spend the rest of whatever I had trying to close it. I didn't know yet what that would cost. If I had, I want to say it wouldn't have changed anything. I'd like to be the man who says that. I'll let you decide when you've heard it all whether I get to. On the 5th night, or the 6th, I heard the horses. She heard them first. She was up off her mat and moving before I'd sorted the sound from the ordinary night. Quick and silent, kicking dirt over the coals so fast the dark came down on us like a lid. She put her hand on my mouth hard, and I understood I was to be a stone. Hooves on rock up top along the rim. Men's voices carrying down the way voices do in that country, thinned and echoed but clear enough. And I knew them. God help me, I knew them. Ren Dutcher's flat drawl, bored, complaining about the hour. And another voice under it, lower, easier. A voice I'd have known in my sleep because I'd been hearing it correct me and command me and disappoint me my whole life. My brother, Vance, had come out himself. They were up on the rim, not 50 feet over our heads, and they'd brought a lantern. I could see the swing of it, a smear of gold sliding along the top of the canyon wall. They were looking. Not for me, they thought me dead, thought the country had taken me like Ren promised. They were looking for the camp, for her people. They'd worked out the band was near, and they'd come in the dark to find them. And if they'd looked down into that slot at the right angle with that lantern, they'd have found something better. A witness with a hole in his side who could put a name to a shooting. She had her hand over my mouth and her body low over mine, and I could feel her heart going through her arm, fast, the only part of her that ever told the truth. And I lay there under her hand in the dark, and I heard my brother's voice say, easy as anything, "They're close. Dry the spring and they'll come to us. Won't have to fire a shot. Country'll do it." Country'll do it, the same words Wren used on me, a family way of speaking. The lantern swung, passed. The voices thinned and moved off along the rim, and the hooves went with them, and after a long while there was nothing but the night bugs and her heart slowing down against my arm, and the two of us breathing in the dark we'd made. She took her hand off my mouth. She didn't move off me right away. She stayed low over me a moment more, and in the last of the starlight coming down the slot, I saw her face close to mine, and it wasn't flat anymore. For just that moment, before she got it back under control, I saw everything it cost her to be brave. The fear and the fury and the plain bone-deep tiredness of a woman who'd been running from that lantern her whole life and was going to run from it till she died. She looked at me, and I want to tell you she saw a friend, but she didn't, not yet. What she saw was worse. She saw the shooting she'd suspected, confirmed. She saw that the man she'd been keeping alive at the cost of her own people's safety was bloodkin to the man who just stood on her sky and promised to dry up the only water her band had left. She sat back. She got the coals going again, small, her back to me. And when she finally spoke, it wasn't to comfort either of us. "Your brother," she said, not a question. "Yes." She fed a twig to the coals. "You were telling the truth about the spring," still not looking at me. "I did not believe you. I thought a man says anything to the one holding the water gourd." A long pause. "But that is his voice at the sink, and you are here in the ground instead of with him." She turned her head finally and looked at me over her shoulder, and her face had gone flat again, all the way flat, which I was learning meant she felt the most. "Why are you here in the ground instead of with him, Cowboy?" And I understood she was asking the real question, not why did I get shot. Whose side are you on, now that you've heard it in his own voice, now that there's no more pretending it's fences and grazing? She was asking me to choose, there in the dark, with my brother's lantern light barely faded off the rim. I opened my mouth, and I found I didn't have the answer ready. That's the shameful truth of it, and I'll set it down. I hesitated, because choosing her meant choosing against everything I'd been born into, and a man doesn't cut himself loose from his whole blood and history in one breath, not even when he knows he ought to. I lay there and I felt the size of it, and I couldn't get the word out. She watched me not answer, and something in her went quiet and closed, and she turned back to her coals, and I understood I'd failed a test I hadn't known was being given, and that it might not be offered twice. Oh, I thought, stupid, desperate, reaching for the only ledger I knew. I owe her. Whatever else I owe her, and I don't die owing. But it was the wrong book. I knew it even then. Some accounts you can't settle with the arithmetic that got you into them. I gave her my answer 3 days late, and I gave it with my hands, not my mouth, because I'd already learned my mouth couldn't be trusted with the important things. I was walking by then, badly, bent to the side like an old fence, but walking. And one morning when she went out to tend her people, I followed her. She heard me come, she heard everything, and she stopped on the trail and turned and looked at me with plain exasperation. A man 3/4 dead insisting on making himself her problem out in the open where a lantern could find us both. She told me to go back. She said it with her hand, a flat chop of air, back. I didn't go back. I came down the trail after her, one slow step at a time, and I followed her to the camp. I'm not going to pretend I understood what I saw there. I'll just tell you what it was. It was smaller than I'd braced for. A dozen brush shelters tucked in a fold of country where the rimrock hid the smoke. Old men, women, a scatter of children, too quiet, the way children get quiet when they've learned quiet is safer than joy. And sickness in it. I could smell it before I could see it, that Swedish sick camp smell. And I could hear it in the coughing that came from 2 or 3 of the shelters. A wet, tearing cough that I knew, because I'd heard it in mining camps and knew it didn't often let a body go. They saw me, and everything stopped. I have never in my life felt what I felt walking into that camp. A dozen faces turned and went to stone, and behind the stone was a fear so old and so earned that it made my own boyhood fears look like a game. A woman pulled a child behind her legs. An old man reached slow for a thing near his mat that might have been a knife. They looked at me, at my face, my color, my brother's face wearing my body, and they saw the lantern. They saw the soldiers. They saw San Carlos and the walk and the river fever. They saw everything my people had ever done to theirs, and they got ready, tired and unsurprised to have it done again. The healer said something sharp, a few words fast and a gesture at me at my side at the way I was bent, and I understood she was telling them what I was. Not a soldier, a shot man, mine. The old man's hand came away from the knife. The child stayed behind the legs. Nobody relaxed. But nobody moved to end me either, and in that camp from those people, that was a mercy so large I didn't have the sense yet to know its size. There was a boy, 6, maybe 7, hard to say. He was small the way hungry children are small. He was in the 3rd shelter, the one the cough was worst in, and he was the reason she'd been leaving me alone for hours. I understood now. The child's hour I'd written in my book and been too much of a fool to picture. He was dying. Anybody could see it. That wet cough had got down into the deep of him, and there was a rattle under it now, and his mother sat beside him with the particular stillness of a person who has already lost children and knows the shape of this one coming. The healer knelt by him. She did what she could, which by then was mostly presence, a cool cloth, a hand, a low, steady song under her breath, the medicine you give when the other medicines run out. And I stood at the edge of it, useless, a whole man with 2 working hands and no idea in the world how to make them worth anything. And I did the only thing I could think to do. I went and got water. There was a seep down the fold, a poor one, but water. I took a gourd and I went down and I filled it and I carried it back up, and I did it again. And again all that long day. I couldn't heal the boy. I couldn't undo 1 hour of what my people had done, but I could carry water for a woman who was carrying grief, and so I carried water. Bent to the side, slow, my wound aching with every trip. Nobody thanked me. Thanks would have been absurd. But along about the 4th or 5th trip I looked up and the boy's mother was watching me. And something in her face had shifted, not warmth. Nothing so much as that, but a kind of terrible weary permission, like she'd decided to let me be a person for the length of an afternoon because she had no strength left to spend on hating me. The boy died a little after dark. I won't tell it. It's not mine to tell, and there are things you shouldn't set down for strangers to look at. I'll only say that I was there at the edge of it, holding a gourd nobody needed anymore, and I watched the healer close a child's eyes with the same hands that had kept mine open, and I understood the arithmetic of her days in a way that broke something loose in me for good. She spent herself on the dying and the dead, hour after hour, a bottomless account of her own, and she had spent whole nights of that finite strength on me, on a coil, and got a shot man walking around carrying water while a child she loved slipped off past her hands. I went off away in the dark and I was sick, and then I sat with my back to a rock and I got the book out, and by feel in the dark, on the blank line where I'd never written her name, I wrote 1 word. Everything. That was my answer. 3 days late in a book she'd never read in the dark after a funeral. Everything, whatever it costs. I didn't know yet what shape it would take, but I'd stopped hesitating. Watching that woman close, that boy's eyes had burned the hesitation clean out of me. And what was left underneath was simple and total and mine. I owed her everything, and everything was the only figure that would balance the page, and I was going to pay it if it took the last thing I had. Here's the thing I hadn't reckoned with, though, and it's the thing that turned the whole matter from grief into a race. Vance was going to win. Not in a gunfight. That wasn't his way. My brother never spent a bullet he could spend a season on instead. He was going to win the slow way, the legal way, the way that let him stay a church-going man. He was going to dry the spring, and he was going to file papers, and he was going to have the army agent declare the band a nuisance and a danger, and there'd be a removal, another walk south to that river, another summer of fever, and it would all be done on paper in offices with signatures, and every man who put his name to it would go home and sleep fine, because none of them would have to watch a boy die of a cough in a brush shelter. That was the genius of my brother's kind of evil. It never had to look at what it did. I knew how it worked because I was a coil. I'd sat at the table. I knew about paper. And I had a piece of paper. It came to me slow over the days after the funeral while I got stronger and carried water and sat at the edge of a grief that would never be mine to enter. The lower quarter section. My father's spite gift. The one piece of the holding that was deeded to me, Elia's, and not to Vance. The old man had done it to needle his eldest, to keep a burr under Vance's saddle forever, and it had worked. It had been a sore between us for years. And that quarter section, I got the map of it clear in my head one night and sat straight up in the dark when I saw it. That quarter section included the spring. The spring at the sink, the one Vance was fixing to poison, it sat on my ground. On paper in the county seat, in a ledger book not unlike my own, that water was legally mine, and my brother couldn't foul it or dry it or fence it without he first got that deed off me, which was exactly why Wren had been so ready to leave me dead in the mud. With me gone, the quarter section would pass to Vance as next of kin, and the last legal obstacle between my brother and that water would be a dead man's estate. I had the one paper that could stop him, the only kind of thing his kind of evil respected, and I understood, sitting up in the dark, that I finally knew the shape of everything. I knew what the debt column wanted. I knew the one payment in my whole world that was the right kind of thing. I could give her the spring. Not the water gourd's worth, the spring the paper. The legal, provable, counter-recorded fact of it, deeded over so that the water her people had drunk from before there were coils or counties would be theirs in the one language the agent and the army and my brother would be forced to hear. A white man's paper, turned around at last and used as a shield instead of a knife. But it meant going back. That was the catch, and it was a bad one. The deed wasn't in my pocket. It was in the strongbox at the county seat, in the recorder's office. And to sign that water over, I had to ride into a town where everybody thought me dead, past a brother who tried to make it true and would try again the second he saw me breathing. To pay the debt, I had to walk back into the exact country that had put me in the healer's care in the first place. And this time, there'd be no mud to hide in and no woman to carry me out. I told her. It was the hardest talking I've ever done because I had to make her understand paper, make a woman whose whole life had been ruined by paper believe that paper could save her, which is a thing I'd have laughed at in her place. I sat across the small fire from her, and I drew it in the dirt with a stick, the quarter section, the spring, my name on it, and I told her what I meant to do. She listened, she let me finish, and then she looked at me a long, long time across the fire, and she said the thing I'll carry to my grave. "You will die," she said, flat certain. The healer's certainty, the voice of a woman who knew the exact weight of a life and how easily it left. "You will ride to your brother's town, where they think you are dead, to give my people water they cannot even hold in their hands, and your brother will finish what his man began." She set another twig on the fire, careful, not looking at me. "I did not carry you out of the wash so you could walk back into it, cowboy. That is not a payment. That is a waste of the thing I saved." And there it was, the thing I hadn't seen, the thing that undid all my clean accounting. To her, it wasn't a debt at all. She hadn't kept me alive to be repaid. She'd kept me alive because she was a healer and I was dying in her water. And now here I was, 3/4 mended, proposing to spend the very life she'd fought for on a gesture. And to her, that wasn't balancing a page. It was throwing away the only thing she'd managed to save in a season of losing everything else. I didn't have an answer for that. I sat there and the fire popped and I understood we were looking at the same act from two sides of a canyon so wide we might as well have been on different worlds. To me, the debt was everything and everything had to be paid. To her, the debt was nothing and the life was the whole point. "Let me be the one to decide what my life's worth," I said finally, quiet. "You've decided the worth of everybody else's for a long time. Let me have this one." Her mouth went flat, all the way flat. And I knew I'd said the truest thing I'd say to her, and the cruelest, and that both of those were the reason she couldn't answer. I rode out before dawn on a borrowed horse, and she didn't stop me, and she didn't say goodbye, and I understood both of those were the closest she could come to saying she'd hear if I came back. I won't stretch the ride out. 2 days, keeping off the roads, my side screaming every mile. I came into the county seat at dusk on the second day with my hat low and my dead man's face turned down, and the strange thing, the thing that told me how thorough Vance had been, was that nobody knew me. There was even a notice, faded on the wall of the mercantile, Elia's coil, lost, presumed drowned, lower Black River. My brother had buried me in the town's mind, so neat I could walk its streets like a ghost. He'd told them the country took me. He'd have believed it himself near enough and slept fine. The recorder's office was shut for the night. I waited in the alley behind it till the moon was down, and then I did a thing my father would have tanned me for and broke in through the back. And I'll tell you, it's a peculiar feeling to burgle a building to steal a paper that's legally your own. I found the strongbox. I didn't have the key. I had 2 days of desperation and a pry bar off a freight dock, and eventually I had the box open and the deed in my hand. My name on it, my father's spite made law, the little map of the quarter section with the spring sitting right there in the middle of it like the whole point of everything, which it was. And then I did the part I'd worked out on the ride. I sat down at the recorder's own desk, in the recorder's own chair, with the recorder's own pen and ink and the blank quitclaim forms he kept in the drawer. And by lamplight, slow, getting every word right because I'd asked a lawyer the shape of it once for a different reason years back, I signed the spring away. Not to the band. I'd thought that through and it wouldn't hold. The army wouldn't honor a deed to people it was trying to move. They'd void it in a week. I signed it into a trust, the way a lawyer had once told me a man could tie up land so it couldn't be sold nor seized nor willed away. Tied it up with the water reserved in perpetuity for the use of the people camped along that stretch of the Black. And I named as the trust's holder the one person in the whole business the law would have to recognize and couldn't easily throw off, because she was neither a soldier's problem nor a white man's heir. I named the healer. In English, spelled the only way I had, I still didn't have her name, so I did the thing I should have done a month before, and I wrote, on the line where the holder's name went, a description that could only mean her. The Apache woman known to the band at the Lower Black as their healer, and no other. I recorded it myself, in the recorder's own book, in the recorder's own hand as near as I could copy it, dated and numbered so it'd sit in the county record like it had always been there. Forgery, I suppose, though every fact in it was true. I put the deed and the trust paper in the oilcloth that had held my debt book, and I put my debt book in with them, because I'd worked out on the ride that I wanted her to have that too, the whole record of a foolish man's accounting, the blank line at the top where I'd never managed to write her name. And then, because I am my father's son and I don't know how to leave a thing half done, I went to find my brother. I've thought a long time about why. I could have ridden straight back. I had the paper was the payment. The smart thing, the thing she'd have wanted, was to slip out of that town a ghost and get the trust into her hands and let the spring be hers. But there was a debt on the other side of the ledger too. Not one I owed, one that was owed to me, and to a boy who died of a cough, and to a walk south nobody came back whole from. And I found, with the deed done and my hands finally empty of the thing that had been eating me, that I couldn't leave the rest of the book unbalanced. I couldn't ride off and let Vance find the trust in the record next week, and know his dead brother had done it and come for the healer with the law and his men, unwarned. If I was going to hand her a shield, I had to make sure the man it was meant to stop knew the shield was real, and knew what it would cost him to test it. So I went to the house, our father's house that was Vance's now, and I stood in the doorway of the room where we'd eaten 1,000 suppers, and my brother looked up from his ledger. He kept one too. We were more alike than I ever wanted to be, and he saw a dead man in the door, and for one single second before he got his face back, I watched Vance Coyle be afraid. I told him what I'd done, flat the way she taught me a thing lands hardest when it's flat. I told him the spring was in trust, recorded, tied up past his reach, reserved for the band forever, and that if a single one of them came to harm, if the water dried, if a soldier walked them south, if a child so much as sickened in a way he could have prevented, the trust had my sworn statement folded into it naming him and Wren Dutcher for the shooting at the sink, dated, witnessed by my own dead hand. Waiting in the county record for the first federal man who came asking why a Coyle turned up alive and then dead again. I told him I'd made myself worth more to him breathing far away than dead nearby, and that the arithmetic of it, I used that word, arithmetic, and watched it land, because he lived by it same as me. The arithmetic of it was the only thing I trusted to hold him. He didn't reach for a gun. That wasn't his way, and anyhow he'd finally understood I'd become a thing more dangerous to him than a witness. I'd become a cost, a permanent one, sitting in the record that would come due the day he touched that band. My brother sat in our father's chair and looked at me, and I watched him do the sum and arrive where I'd needed him to arrive, and he said, low, the last thing he ever said to me. You always did want the old man to leave you something. A pause. He left you a burr, you've made it a knife. And he closed his ledger, which was his way of ending an account. Get out of my county, Ilias, you're dead here, see you stay that way. I got out. I rode through the dark with my empty hands and my aching side, and the strangest lightness I'd ever felt. The lightness of a man who's paid a debt he'd carried so long he'd forgot how heavy it was. It took me 4 days to find the canyon again, and I only found it because she let me. She had a scout up on the rim, the old man from the first day, the one who'd reached for the knife, and I felt eyes on me a full day before I saw the smoke, and I rode in slow with my hands where they could be seen and let them decide, again, whether to let me be a person. She was at the fire. She looked up and saw me, and I watched her do the thing she never did, the thing she'd spent a lifetime teaching herself not to do. I watched her face come open, just for a second. Relief and fury and something I won't name because it wasn't mine to be given, and I hadn't earned it. Then it went flat, and she stood, and she waited for me to come to her because she was not going to walk toward a man who'd ridden off to die against her wishes. If I wanted her, I could come the whole way myself. I got down off the horse, and I came the whole way, and I took the oilcloth packet out of my coat, and I put it in her hands. She opened it slow, the deed, the trust paper, my debt book. She couldn't read the English, I knew that, but she knew paper. She knew it in her bones as the thing that had unmade her whole world. And she stood there holding the very weapon that had walked her south and buried her children and dried up every promise ever made to her people. And she looked at me, not understanding yet, braced for it to be one more. So I told her. I stood in front of her with my hat off, and I told her plain what was in her hands. The spring, hers, in perpetuity, tied up past my brother and the army and the county, reserved for her band forever, held in the name of the healer at the lower black and no other. The water she'd cleaned by carrying a dying coil out of it. I'd made it hers on the one paper her enemies would be forced to honor. I'd taken the knife that had been used on her people all these years, and I'd handed it back to her, turned around, a shield. She didn't say anything. I want to tell you she wept, or thanked me, or that her face did some large thing you could put in a story. It didn't. She stood very still, and she looked at the papers, and she looked at me, and she looked at the papers, and her mouth, that flat, unbudging, hard-learned line of a mouth, moved and worked, and could not find its shape. She who always had the last word, who'd met me flat and certain from the first dark minute, who'd never once been at a loss in front of a coil, she stood there with her people's water in her two hands, and she could not make a single sound. I'd left her speechless, and it was the only time in all of it I ever saw her lose the flatness for good and all, not open, exactly, but undone. A woman looking at the one kind of gift she'd stopped believing the world contained, given by the last kind of hands she'd have looked to for it. I opened the debt book, the last thing, and I showed her the top of the page, the blank line where a name should be, and I told her I'd never written it because I'd never earned the asking, and that if she wanted now, she could tell it to me, and I'd write it there, and the account could stand closed under her own name instead of a stranger's. She looked at the blank line a long time,